The second reset of Ulduar has come to an end, which means once again it is raid review time. Will Ulduar live up to the hype as the hardest tier that Classic has ever seen, or will it fall short? So for a bit of context here, on the channel this is something I've done since early Classic, where after the second reset we'll take a look at the public stats on Warcraft logs to see how many guilds have managed to clear each boss, and assess how difficult the raid has been compared to previous tiers. I started using the end of the second reset as I figured everyone who wanted to raid would have had the chance to do so, and to avoid things such as week 1 bugs, cheese strats that might have been patched out the game and so on. And since all previous videos have been done using this format, I've just kind of stuck with it now. We will be going by progression clears, which is the first time a guild group has defeated a boss, so we aren't going to be getting duplicates. And for Ulduar, since there's so many different ways to clear the raid, I've opted to cover 25-man normal and hard modes only. I did take a look at 10-man numbers originally, and in short, the number of progression kills on normal are very similar to 25. I expect a guild that's done 25 to have attempted 10-man with some variation of the same roster. The difference is on the hard modes, where on 10-man, without exception, there is a way higher percentage of raids that have been able to clear the majority of encounters. Again, this is very much to be expected. 10-man is designed to be easier than 25, so in the interest of keeping things simple and the data from the hardest version of the raid, I'm going to be sticking with 25-man this time around. Also, we're going to be going by order of appearance of bosses on Warcraft logs, since whilst the normal modes kind of make sense progression-wise in order, the hard modes do not at all. Finally, for a bit of food for thought here, previous record holders of hardest raid include the 2 final bosses of the Sunwell. Muri saw 5,169 progression clears by the end of week 2, and Kil'jaeden 3,663. Though so far the numerically hardest tier in Classic has been tier 5, the pre-nerf end bosses posing the biggest challenge. By the end of week 2, Kael'thas was defeated 2,666 times, and Lady Vash to this date has been the toughest encounter so far in Classic, with 2,093 clears by the end of week 2. So is Ulduar harder? Well, it can be if you want it to be, but it doesn't have to be. Let's see the numbers. Before we go on, a quick word from today's sponsor, NordVPN. Now, you've probably heard the term VPN thrown around all of the time, but what actually is it? Well, it's a virtual private network, and it's a system which encrypts your internet traffic whilst hiding your IP and virtual location. Among the various benefits this will bring you, it secures your online data whilst you're browsing or using any app. You can have peace of mind that you are browsing securely. You can cut out the wait for the latest TV show to be localized in your region, which can take seemingly forever sometimes. Log in via NordVPN, swap to a secure server in the location you need to, and there you go, you'll now have access. If you spend time on public Wi-Fi, you'll realize it's inherently insecure because, well, anybody could have access. So if you spend time commuting, in hotels, coffee shops, out and about, NordVPN would be a good idea. After all, your online activity is your business, so secure it with NordVPN. It's never been a better time to sign up, as you can get a huge discount with a purchase of a 2-year plan and a bonus gift on top. Get the exclusive NordVPN deal here at nordvpn.com/WillE. It's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. Many thanks as always to Nord for the sponsor today. Let's get back to WoW. The first fight is a return to everyone's favourite thing about Wrath, which you just totally forgot how much you loved: vehicle combat. To gear up your character, look up your BIS, learn your rotation, and then be told to equip random high item level stuff and get inside a vehicle and learn something completely different. Great. Fortunately, Flame Leviathan is at least more interesting than Malagos was, where you just pressed 112. Normal mode saw about 9,200 clears, and oh boy does this fight disappear in a matter of seconds on this difficulty. Hard mode with all 4 towers active does present a much greater challenge, seeing only 1,507 clears by the second reset. That's already beaten Lady Vash then. This will be a continuing trend. The real challenge on hard mode is the amount of organization and different things happening at once. This is a seriously chaotic fight. There's players getting fired on top of the Flame Leviathan to shut down the turrets, laying tar and setting them on fire to stop the plants, interrupting flame vents, maintaining pyrite stacks, avoiding the adds. There's fire falling from the sky, there's frost bombs, there's lightning. For an entry encounter, this hard mode is definitely more of a challenge than some later fights. In week 1 and 2, many guilds will have skipped this hard mode and just gone on to later bosses to gear up a bit more, and I can't blame you for doing that. Past the Flame Leviathan, we have Ignis, the Furnace Master, a fight that was buffed late on the PTR for Ulduar. Still not overly all that challenging. Similar to Flame Leviathan, it saw around 9,200 clears by the end of week 2. A relatively straightforward fight where the majority of the raid can kind of just stand behind the boss and nuke him, whilst the off-tank deals with the adds that need to be shattered by a large hit from a caster. It looks quite fun from a healer perspective too, as there's frequently a ton of raid damage going out from flame jets. Ignis has no hard mode, so get him down, and then we're going to go straight over to another boss which also doesn't have a hard mode, Razor Scale. This fight's berserk timer was lowered all the way down to 6 minutes as part of pre-nerf Ulduar, meaning if you don't get her to 50% on her first landing, she's going to be pretty close to berserk by the time you get her down again. In fact, the speed achievement, a quick shave, isn't too far off the berserk timer as a whole. Either way, it's a short and very straightforward add phase at the start before a burn phase when she lands. Razor Scale, similar to normal bosses so far, saw around 9,200 clears. Which brings us to XT002 Deconstructor, which on the critical path through Ulduar is the second boss in the instance. On normal mode, very similar to the others so far, he saw about 9,200 clears, being quite a simple fight when you can just DPS through the heart phases and have him more or less a loop in this state for the entire fight. The range can go and finish off adds on the side, and it's some nice and easy loot before moving on into Ulduar proper, unless that is you wanted to try 25-man hard mode XT during the first 2 resets. Now in week 1, XT hard mode was not defeated, not even once. And I would have said back then, well, all the guilds capable of defeating him are going to have skipped him. You don't need to do XT hard mode for any server first achievements or to be able to access Algalon later, so the guilds with the best DPSs and the deepest rosters just wouldn't have bothered. Well, the second reset went by and the top guilds in the world tried XT and they didn't even get remotely close to beating the DPS check. Also, XT was the only pre-nerf Ulduar encounter to receive targeted nerfs on the PTR because his DPS check was too high, and even though he was nerfed, nobody could beat him. Well, by the end of the second reset, Blizzard, it would seem, have come to the conclusion that nobody is going to be able to beat this boss anytime soon, and he's just way too difficult for how early he's placed in the instance, especially when he gatekeeps nearly every other boss in Ulduar. As of the reset, XT has received huge nerfs to both 10 and 25-man modes. The 10-man wasn't too bad, and I did manage to do it on the second reset, though you still definitely needed a solid group. Though the 25-man version, I'm not entirely surprised to see it get nerfed. The best guilds in the world weren't getting him below 30% from what I hear, but now with the nerfs, they've taken over 20 million health off of the hard mode version of the fight. It's got lower health comparatively than it did post nerf now. I think it's been relegated to one of the easier hard modes now. That being said, there's still a ton of raid damage going out. It's just changed from a DPS check to a mechanics and healer check instead. Either way, if your BIS drops on XT, well, that's some good news for you, I suppose. But for the first 2 resets of Ulduar, XT hard mode was never defeated, making him the hardest boss ever in Classic, and to be honest, most end of tier Mythic bosses don't make it past the second reset on Retail, so Classic is officially harder than Retail. You heard it here first. Either way, do give XT hard mode a go this week. If you can do Thorum and you can do Freya, I think this one will be very much in range for you. Moving on into Ulduar then, our next stop is the Assembly of Iron. This encounter has 3 separate difficulties because I guess 2 weren't enough. Normal mode is defeating Stormcaller Brundir last. This version of the fight saw about 9,200 clears, similar to pretty much all the normal modes so far. Hard mode, however, raises the bar quite significantly, seeing about 893 clears by the end of the second reset. That's less than 10% of the number of guilds that managed this on normal. The difference in this version of the fight is a severe DPS check to kill the final boss alive, Steelbreaker. He places a debuff on the main tank that will kill them after 30 seconds, and each time a player dies he heals a ton of health and gains extra damage. So realistically, you have 1 minute before he kills both tanks and just randomly starts one-shotting people with AoE. As a rule of thumb, if you're doing hard mode Iron Council and anyone apart from a tank dies in the last phase, it's more or less gonna be a wipe. This version of the fight is also required in order to be able to start the quest to take on Algalon. It can be a bit frustrating at times due to how unforgiving the last phase is, but then again, you could get a first kill like ours where we were under 1 second off of wiping, making it pretty fun stuff. Beyond the Iron Council is Colagon, another normal mode only boss, again with around 9,200 clears. A short and simple fight, though things can go very wrong if you kill both the arms at the same time. Remember that each arm removes 15% of the boss's maximum health, and focus the right arm, that's the one on your left. We even found out you can just stand in the I-beams by yourself because they don't really hit all that much. Either way, blast him down and the center chamber will be opened. The first boss to get down in here is Oriaya, and you guessed it, about 9,200 clears. This is another normal mode only encounter, where the most dangerous part of it is the pull, by far. AoEing down the cats right at the start is the fastest way to deal with them, but one-shots on unsuspecting tanks or players too eager with AoE are not uncommon at all. Once the first set of ads are down, it's fairly straightforward in terms of dealing with future ads, stacking with the Sonic Screech in front of the boss to split the damage, and interrupting her after the fear. Meaning we're now onto the 4 keepers of Ulduar. First up is Hodia. On normal mode he saw about 9,100 clears. Whilst normal mode doesn't have any hard DPS requirements, it can be quite intensive on the healers, but isn't too far off of other bosses' difficulties. Where things get different is on hard mode, where he only saw about 600 clears within the first 2 weeks. Hodia hard mode in principle is easy, kill the boss in 2 minutes or less. In practice, this can be a bit more problematic. And now I'm going to go on a rant about Hodia for however long it takes, because this has to be one of the worst design bosses I've ever seen in WoW. I almost don't want to believe this is the finished version of the fight that shipped. Also, quick reminder, this is the less RNG version of Hodia. The fires used to have a more randomized spawn timer. There's 2 big problems I have with this fight. One is how the mechanics are displayed visually, and 2 is the amount of RNG. How do you know when you're in range of a fire without a weak aura? You don't. Okay, you don't get the stacking debuff anymore, but there's no positive indication that you're in range. How do you know how many stacks of Singe the boss has, a debuff that you need to maintain to do hard mode, without a weak aura? You don't. It can get hidden on the debuff table. What else do we have? The icicles that drop. How about a nice blue circle that gets a bit lighter than knocks you back? And we're going to make them stack as well, so you can't even see which one's going to go off. On top of that, let's spawn snow from the ceiling as well, so you legitimately can't even see what's going on. And that's even before we get onto the RNG on this fight. On our first few tries, we really weren't all that close to the DPS check in week 1. The very next try, what happens but the fire spawns right next to the ranged DPS group. The beams come down just in front of us where we can move between them, and the storm cloud goes on the caster group. We went from about 15 to 20% off to an easy hard mode kill. And I didn't even mention, if you kill this boss 1 second too late, not only do you lose the extra loot from the encounter, but you will also lose your first chance to be able to fight Algalon later on if you can do all the other hard modes. At least hard mode is a short fight, and gear will go a long way to meeting the DPS check. A lot of fights in Ulduar show why hard mode was great. This one though, really ain't it for me. After Hodia is Thorim, which at the end of week 2 saw just under 9,000 clears on normal and about 3,300 on hard mode. Everyone expected this to be the easiest hard mode encounter, and that's very much proven to be true. Differences between normal and hard mode are Sarah casting blizzards and frost novas during the second phase, and the boss having a bunch more health and damage. Not a super tight DPS check, more of a mechanical check. The boss frequently casts chain lightning, which does more damage the more targets it hits. So if a big clump of players get targeted when moving, you can easily lose a bunch of people in a single moment. So stay cool, stick to your position, don't stack, and it should go down for some nice easy hard mode loot. Third keeper is Freya in the Observatory of Life. On normal mode she has about 8,900 clears, and on hard mode about 2,060. This one was expected to be the second most accessible hard mode encounter. I'm not so sure that's true now that XT's been nerfed, but time will tell. It's a strange encounter having to deal with 2 waves of 3 sets of ads. Hard mode adds some complexity to the fight through through players getting rooted and tons of extra random burst damage going out. This one really isn't a DPS check either. You can lose a whole bunch of players early on in the fight and still meet the damage required in the final phase when you just have to burn the boss down through a minor heal over time. The final keeper is Mimorpg, who saw about 8,400 clears on normal mode and just under 600 on hard mode. This has to be one of the best designed encounters in the instance. For me, it really lives up to the hype. On normal mode, things aren't too bad. Hard mode ramps up this fight significantly, adding a ton more outgoing damage, and of course, fire. Not only just fire, but fire that will chase you around the room. The fight gradually ramps up as time goes on, getting more and more chaotic. It's not exactly a DPS check still, but probably the biggest awareness check in the instance by far. By the last phase, there is fire chasing the raid, frost bomb, the head blast, hand pulse, the one-shot barrage, mine, shot blast, rocket strike, and emergency firebots that have a 15-yard pulsing silence aura. I think that's about everything. Oh, also about half of these mechanics will one-shot you as well. Suffice to say, there is so much going on, it's just not possible to call everything, and people just really need to be thinking where they're going to be moving to a few seconds in advance. Until of course the boss randomly spawns fire there. For me, this was a really fun fight. Expect your first kill to go right down to the wire. Beyond the keepers is General Vezax, who is a gimmick boss. Gimmicks and vehicles, the two things I never really like to see. Saying that, I don't mind Vezax too much. At least it's far from the hardest boss in the instance. He saw about 7,800 clears on normal mode and just over 1,000 on hard mode. The hard mode is kind of counterintuitive to any other fight you've ever done in the game. And I think if people just forgot how to play your class normally, this encounter is easier than it seems. The gimmick is you cannot regenerate mana except from a few sources. There are also frequent shadow crashes that leave a pool on the floor, increasing damage and reducing mana costs. So as a caster, you want to only cast inside these pools. On hard mode, eventually a large ad will spawn that you have to heroism and defeat as soon as possible before a stacking raid-wide pulsing shadow damage aura kills off your raid. It's a question of balancing how much mana you spend on the boss and keeping enough to finish this big ad off fast. I'd be patient for 2 separate pools to spawn rather than finding your raid getting forced into one big group and all having to move for shadow crashes. Which brings us to one of the big final bosses of the instance, the old god, Yogg-Saron. Now Yogg, like many fights so far, has a ton of different difficulties, and I'm going to be talking about 3 of them as there is a huge difference between each one. Normal mode, aka 4 lights, is requesting assistance from all 4 Titan Keepers that you've already fought. This hugely increases your health, your damage, and adds a ton more utility to the fight, such as being able to restore sanity. This is a mechanic which during the fight is drained by being hit by mechanics, and if you ever hit 0, you're permanently mind controlled. Other benefits include enemies having their cast speeds reduced, you can cheat death, and so on and so forth. On this mode, Yogg saw about 6,400 defeats. That's over 3 times as many as Lady Vash did by the end of week 2. However, hard mode Yogg, or 1 light, tells a very different story. This version of Yogg has the assistance of the Titan Keeper Thorim. He makes it so the ads in the final burn phase of the fight can be killed once they reach 1 health. It's still very much a trial to get to that phase cleanly, but you can take a very long time to finish off a kill here. Yogg 1 light saw 1,285 clears during the first 2 resets. Yogg-Saron 0 lights is a fight that's on a whole other level compared to anything in the instance so far. Without any help from the keepers, the whole fight becomes much harder, but it turns the last phase into a serious DPS check. With the Immortal Guardians now actually being immortal, it's only a matter of time until the raid gets overwhelmed. During this last phase, Yogg also frequently casts Lunatic Gaze, dealing damage and rapidly reducing sanity for all players facing him. He does do this on all difficulties, but on 0 lights, you're on the clock to get his health down, and not many classes can deal full damage whilst facing away from the boss, apart from warlocks. In fact, if you go through the logs of guilds that were able to take out Yogg 0 during the first 2 resets, you'll see many of them will have 6 to 8 warlocks. This was very much the case back in the day too. The positional requirement on the final phase is hard to overcome. Nevertheless, if you get Yogg 0 down, you are guaranteed to get a Mimorpg's head mount drop. How many guilds beat this challenge in the first 2 weeks? 148. Good luck on this one. The first kill feels more like downing a hard boss on retail than anything in Classic. But there is one final challenge, the hard mode only encounter, Algalon the Observer. On Classic, he also had his health and damage buffed by 30%, and you only get attempts for 1 hour per week before he despawns. And it's kinda hard. If you remember back in the Sunwell, Brutalis made every tank heavy damage encounter before him look like nothing. Well, Algalon makes Brutalis look about as threatening as the chess event to your tanks. This guy claps tanks like nothing you have ever seen. You will have a pull where the fight starts and your tank is just instantly dead after 1 second. You really need to prioritize loot to the tank before you can make attempts on this encounter on either 10 or 25. Other than that, the fight is mechanically simple, but just very stressful on tanks and healers. Collapsing stars need to be controlled by ranged DPS, as when each one dies they will deal huge raid-wide damage. If this is poorly timed alongside pretty much anything else happening, it can easily cause a wipe. And on this fight, even losing the odd player early can lead to problems down the line. It's very much an encounter that will show up players who don't realise they're in a position where they're very liable to be one-shot. At 20%, strangely enough, instead of it being a rush or a showdown with a boss, the fight just kind of turns into easy mode. The boss despawns pretty much all of the dangerous mechanics and just has a few adds that come out of portals by the side and need to be tanked. Provided your tank doesn't fall over and there is enough people left in the raid, you should be able to secure a kill, collect that sweet hard mode loot, and then head on over to Dalaran to enjoy some good old raising your eyes to the sky and observing. Over the first 2 resets, 119 guilds were able to win a fight versus Algalon 25-man, and I suspect the 1 hour despawn time had a big part in that. And those are our stats for Ulduar. So on normal mode, there were some 3 times more clears compared to what the end bosses saw in tier 5. If you want to approach the raid from this angle, it's definitely not the hardest raid ever, not by a long shot. In fact, statistically, it was pretty easy. Now, if you wanted to include the hard mode encounters, however, depending on whether or not you want to include XT, I wouldn't bother personally. It wasn't going to be gradually worked towards by incremental gear upgrades. People would just skip it forever until his loot was irrelevant. Having a boss gatekeep that hard that early just wasn't going to work out. Anyways, if we're taking the other hard modes into account, Ulduar was way harder than anything else we've had before by a big margin. Every single hard mode bar Thorim saw fewer clears than Lady Vash did in Serpent Shrine Cavern. Freya hard mode landed pretty close at 2060 when Vash was 2093 clears. Hard mode Freya similar to pre-nerf Vash? That does sound about right actually. The easiest hard mode, as predicted by many, was Thorim, though perhaps pre-nerf XT will be joining him pretty soon. Whilst the toughest hard modes were statistically Hodia, Mimiron, followed by Yogg Zero and Algalon the Observer, who were on a whole other level of difficulty compared to everything else. Personally, I think the biggest challenge this tier has to offer is Yogg Zero 25-man. Algalon only having 1 hour per reset is very restrictive, whereas Yogg you can just keep going and going until everyone gets the fight. Then again, motivation to do Algalon is much greater because his entire loot table is Biss versus a much harder Yogg fight for a mount which only 1 person can use. Also, I don't know how long you're going to really need to stack Warlocks for Yogg Zero and how viable that strategy will be. I would say it's a step up compared to any other raid tier so far for sure. For me, it's been a very enjoyable return to progression raiding, which isn't something we've had too much of so far in Classic. It feels as though it's a bit of a turning point for raiding as a whole too, what with us having 10 and 25 and now different difficulties within that. I am looking forward to Trial of the Grand Crusader and Icecrown Citadel Heroic, and I kind of hope Blizz takes a step back to consider the likes of pre-nerf once again. We've seen that during Ulduar there is accessible content from normal modes and 10-man, and then there's 25-man hard modes and Algalon and Yogg Zero for people who want a challenge too. I don't necessarily want to spend hours wiping on the Beasts of Northrend for the sake of it, but Ulduar has had a good balance for both crowd of modern gamers, and I hope this is a balance we can find again and to look forwards to in the 2 later tiers of Wrath. And that's my Ulduar breakdown. How's Ulduar going for your guild at the moment? Still progressing? First time raider? Or are you an Ulduar veteran? And has it lived up to any expectations you came into it with? Let me know below. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in. I'll see you all on the next one very soon.